Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Hi there guys, it's Adam Martyn here, and welcome back to another video. And for today I thought I'd put to you a hypothetical in a way. You know, with the launch of ITVX this winter, it got me thinking about the future of other main channels, and I mean, we've already sort of discussed it a little bit. We recently did a video looking at the BBC's future. The Director General, Tim Davie, recently gave a speech outlining, or at least hinting, where the corporation would be going in the next 10 years, you know, with the sort of move away from the traditional broadcast medium of linear television channels and more to a digital future. Now, you could argue other channels have already started making that move towards that sort of future. You could say Channel 4 started to do it somewhat with their, well, not rebranding, but their consolidation of brands, and ITV with the launch of ITVX, which is, you know, a streaming platform first and foremost, where you can access live television as well as a litany of other content. Now, I've seen some say after the launch of ITVX that the BBC absolutely need to do this as well. Well, lest we forget that the BBC does already have its own streaming service in a way. It has BBC iPlayer, which has been on the go since late 2007, and I would argue was actually probably one of the forerunners of how to do a streaming-based website, at least here in the UK. So forget the international players like Netflix and all that sort of stuff, but I remember BBC iPlayer when it launched back in the day. You know, it was quite this revolutionary thing, because you've got to remember, if you were around, at that time, yes, DVR recorders were starting to come in with like your skyboxes and stuff, but that was for those who could afford them. For families like mine, you know, by 2007, if I wanted to catch a program, you know, if I didn't want to miss it, I was still recording it on VHS tapes. I mean, that's how far VHS tapes were still being used. So for me, BBC iPlayer, to be able to watch a program for up to 7 days and then gradually 30 days and, you know, beyond that, that was a revolution to me. So BBC iPlayer still stands today, 15 years on, and as you'd expect, contains ways to watch all the BBC channels live. You can listen to, or at least you can access BBC Sounds from there, which is like its whole separate thing, I suppose, but you can access BBC's 1, 2, 3, 4, CBeebies, CBBC, the news, Parliament, all that sort of stuff. You know, there's a lot of access. So, you know, the question of BBC doing its own ITVX, I don't think they'd necessarily, if they were going to do that, start from the ground up. I think they'd more adapt BBC iPlayer into something brand new. In case in point, you know, we've seen a lot of these TV brands talk about uniting under one name. So, you know, for ITV, yes, all of their channels are still numbered, but they are united under the name of ITV. Channel 4 doing the same. So if the BBC was to do that, maybe eventually they'd ditch the iPlayer name and just go with, well, I don't know, BBCX? It's not very likely, is it? But, you know, something to that effect, a hub of BBC content where you can access everything, anything that's still broadcast on the television or on the radio via BBC Sounds or whatever that becomes in the future. Do you see what I mean? So the iPlayer might become the one-stop hub for all BBC content, because let's face it, iPlayer as a name, it was very 2007. You know, that era was when, like, you know, the iPod and the iPhone actually debuted in 2007. So putting a lowercase I in front of things was very much in. You know, now I'd argue the phrase iPlayer, you know, it's entered the colloquial lexicon. A lot of people use it to refer to the BBC, but I think in terms of just, you know, in terms of the name, I do think it's a little bit outdated now. So if the BBC were to do their own version of ITX, well, what would it look like? Well, I'd argue not too dissimilar to what BBC iPlayer looks like now. I think, you know, if you go on the main page of it, you'd have brand new content. I mean, at the time of recording this, we've just had the Bad Education reunion, a show I used to watch back in the day, so it's very cool to see that front and centre. So on a new sort of site like this for the BBC, yeah, new content, maybe then advertise different genres of content than they offer. Because when you look at all of these now, even iPlayer's doing this, ITVX is doing this, all of like the little windows into these programs, it all is now following that very similar, whether it's, you know, Netflix or Disney Plus style, where you've got lots of little boxes underneath a certain genre or what's trending or whatever, and then you've got some long boxes to try and advertise specific shows. So it's all been formatted very carefully. But I think if you were going to adapt BBC iPlayer into something new, so just let's imagine, shall we? Let's imagine a world, a hypothetical world, where traditional broadcast television has been completely done away with. You know, there's no such thing as like traditional broadcast channels anymore. ITVX is around, all that sort of stuff, you know. So what would the BBC do? Well, I think on this new streaming site, they wouldn't necessarily break it down into channels, or not as minute as, say, you know, BBC 1, 2, 3, 4. I think they'd still have, you know, their main programming, their new content, that'd be front and center. But in terms of categories, I'd think in the future, the only sort of subcategories that they would arguably or should keep in this way would be CBBC, possibly CBeebies, and BBC News. So let me just explain what I mean, because yes, BBC's 1 to 4 offer completely different sorts of content when you like break it down, whether that's in terms of genre or demographic. And of course, the BBC's idea, its central remit that's been present for 100 years, is to be accessible and to appeal to as many, well, all demographics if possible. But in a world where traditional channels don't exist anymore, the use for numbering them wouldn't exist. I think it'd make more sense to just break it down into straightforward genres, like sort of like what ITVX does now. I mean, if you go on ITVX and go on categories, you are instantly taken to several different genres. You know, you've got factual, drama, soaps, children, film, sport, comedy, news, entertainment, and so on. So I think the need to break, you know, they don't break it down to ITV's 1 to 4, they break it down by genre. So if the BBC were to adapt iPlayer in the future, in a world where traditional broadcast telly isn't as much of a thing, I think they'd have to go down that route, to be honest. I mean, they do already have a category section on the iPlayer that offers far more genres than ITVX does, to be honest. You know, you've got the stalwarts like drama, soaps, comedy, etc. But they've got things that ITVX doesn't have. You know, they've got science and nature, lifestyle, music, different regions of the UK, you know, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, all that sort of stuff. So they already do that. I just think the numbered channel system on the iPlayer, or that channels tab if you like, unless live TV was still around in some form, you could do away with that entirely. But what I'd like to see that isn't on iPlayer at the minute, if they do adapt this, you know, if they move away from traditional television, would be to have some sort of archive feature full of not just old BBC programming, but maybe elements like their continuity, things like that. Now, some people already say, Adam, for archive programming, you know, the BBC already has this. They've got BritBox, which, you know, still, even though the BBC doesn't necessarily have a bigger stake in that anymore, BritBox still has a wealth of BBC legacy content, you know, from the golden days of BBC comedy shows or old dramas and stuff like that. BritBox has that for you. Well, let's just, you know, okay, it exists for sure, but what happens if BritBox folds? You know, there's already been some talk about, will BritBox disappear because, you know, ITVX does have, if you get ITVX Premium, you know, the paid service, which is the same as BritBox, then you get access to it automatically. So some are speculating that eventually, maybe in a year or two, BritBox as a standalone service will fold and will only become part of ITVX to try and entice more people to that. I could certainly see that as being a possibility, not saying it's going to happen, but it's a possibility. So if BritBox goes and you don't want to subscribe to ITVX, well, where do you get your BBC legacy content from? Well, an adaptation of the iPlayer or a future iPlayer might rectify this. You know, you could have it under its own banner. You could maybe split it up by decade, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. You could have dedicated box sets for particularly long-running shows, you know, whether that's episodes of EastEnders dating back to way back at the beginning, or things like Casualty, Holby City. You know, there's scope to do this on a BBC controlled platform. I guess the issue the BBC has is, I guess most of their content up until, say, the late 80s would be fairly accessible for them to do, because, you know, back then the BBC produced a lot of its own material. It was able to do that, whereas at the 90s going forward, so like the last 30 years, they've had to outsource a lot of the production to different companies that basically produce it for the BBC. They still make some programs themselves, but a lot of programs, particularly some of the bigger programs, have been made by other production companies. So I guess then, unless those deals were done way back when, which I doubt they were, because, you know, streaming wasn't a thing, you've got to then talk to production companies. You've got to agree on, okay, well, if this goes on your streaming platform, who gets the money, or how do we split the money, etc. So there might be that barrier, but it'd definitely be worth, I think, having like an archive banner on BBC iPlayer or whatever it will be in the future, just to give people that access. That's if BritBox folds. And what I meant about continuity, I mean, this is incredibly niche, and I know will probably only appeal to people like myself, people like you guys who watch this sort of channel and enjoy these sorts of videos, but I think there is an interest there, you know, in seeing classic television presentation, how it was presented, how it holds up. And I think it would be fantastic if the BBC could introduce an option on the iPlayer to basically showcase that content, whether it's all continuity, things like trailers, the continuity announcers, or just like, you know, a revolving ident channel. You know, you get all these live things on like YouTube now that are just like rolling. Imagine if you had like a live rolling channel that was just classic BBC idents from like all across the channels. That would be so cool just to whack that on, you know, because most of those idents have nice music to them as well. It'd just be a fascinating feature to have. And I know then, you know, the instant thing to rise from that would be, well, okay, you could argue the interest is in there, the interest is there even in a small sense, but what about cost? Well, surely if the BBC has, you know, clips of all this in its archive and stuff like that, it has that at its disposal, surely it wouldn't cost too much to introduce that as like a separate strand and for them to introduce. I could be proven wrong, you know, there might be some out there who say, Adam, you've completely missed the point of that, there's a whole litany of problems that might come with that, but I don't know, I just think that could be a really cool that could be a little cool thing that would give the BBC something that ITVX doesn't have, because let's face it, with all the streaming services now, whether it is the ITVXs, your All 4s, anything like that, or even your Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever, it's about standing out, it's about having something different, whether that's in terms of the content you offer is different, or the presentation, all that sort of stuff. So if the BBC could utilise somehow that vast catalogue from the past 100 years to really, I'm not saying focus on the history, don't make that the focus, you've got to focus on the new, you've got to focus on the new innovations and stuff, but I think having something on your streaming site to honour your history and put it, you know, on the same bar as like new content or all that sort of stuff, I think that would be really useful for the BBC. Ultimately, of course, all of what I'm talking about here is all hypothetical. This is not confirmation that anything's happening to the iPlayer. I'm merely going off, you know, the speech that Tim Davie gave the other day, talking about the future of the BBC, how it's going to be more digital-led. But I do honestly think the iPlayer name will drop in the coming years, partly just because of its age, and I also think partly to, as they say, unify the brand even. Do you know what I mean? I really think that will come to pass in the next few years. But, I mean, what do you think? Do you think the BBC will adapt the iPlayer into being more like ITVX? I mean, it's already like ITVX in many ways. You know, you can watch live TV, there's back catalogue of programming there, you can watch recently broadcast stuff. I think the only thing BBC iPlayer doesn't have, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, the only thing iPlayer doesn't have is exclusive original content. We're seeing ITVX starting to do this now that the rollout's happened. You're getting brand new stuff like Litvinenko, which stars David Tennant. You know, that's an ITVX exclusive. You can't even watch that on broadcast TV at the minute. You've got to watch it on ITVX. And, you know, they're promising new exclusive stuff every single week, which is, that's a big call. I'm not saying they can't do it, but that's a big ask. But I think if BBC iPlayer can do the same, introduce, even if it's not new, just original content, whether that's documentaries or anything really, then that can help give it the edge. I know the BBC, you could argue, has less money to do that as ITV does. Of course, ITV is funded by commercial revenue amongst other things, whereas the BBC isn't. But I think if they can do that, that would certainly give them the edge. Or are you of the opinion that BBC iPlayer is pretty much perfect as it is? Do you think it should remain as is? Is it functional enough? Do you think they don't need to change, you know, don't fix what's not broken, or that sort of thing? I just think it's an interesting topic for discussion. But if you enjoyed this video, you know, please leave a like on it. It really helps us out. And again, I want to know your thoughts down in the comments. So do you think iPlayer needs to adapt, drop the name, adapt to become even more like ITVX and stuff like that? Or do you think it's fine as is? And if you were to adapt BBC iPlayer, I want to know some of your ideas. You might agree with me on some things, but I might have missed out some completely obvious ideas to you guys. So if you think you've got a good idea for a revamped or brand new version of the iPlayer under a different name, let me know in the comments. Also, subscribe to the channel if you're brand new as well. We'd love to have you aboard. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, The Broken Kitsumanoid, Tobias Krotz, Globe of Reviews, Trev Hughes, Kevin Aikman, Derek Chambers, Sean Knock, Bailey Green, and DSTV New Zealand, our AMTV staff members.